All right, continuing on with our review course for the Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems Rating, Part 107 rating, we're going to talk about airport operations this afternoon. Remember that on the test guide, the FAA's official test guide, it says that this portion of the test is meant to determine that the remote pilot applicant demonstrates an understanding of the types of airports, including controlled, uncontrolled, heliport, and seaplane bases. The applicant understands what air traffic control tower communication sounds like, so that they may be assured that you'll be able to monitor and interpret ATC communication with manned aircraft to help them maintain situational awareness. The applicant ought to be able to understand at least basic understanding of runway markings and signage, definitely understand traffic patterns used by manned aircraft pilots, the terminology and the location of those places. Strangely enough, they want you to know a little bit about security identification display areas and around airports. They want you to understand the sources for airport data, such as aeronautical charts or the chart supplement US. Also, this section is also going to question you about birds and wildlife hazards and reporting, and also about airport lighting. So this is a review again to prepare you for the written test. And so those are the items that can be expected in this section of the written test that you may be questioned on, or maybe you won't be questioned on at all. So they select certain portions of the test. So anyway, we're going to go through it. Hopefully it'll be less than a 45-minute video here. Try to keep it short. In the last review section, we talked about the phonetic alphabet and some about pilot lingo. Just reminding you to make sure to follow up on that, thinking through those questions. And this specific question, we did talk about that last time. Just for review, look this over, pause the video if you need to. Here's another one. Again, pause the video if you need to go over this. We did go over it in the previous lesson, but just make sure you understand this. In this final example, ATC radar facility issues the following advisory to a pilot flying on a heading of 270 degrees, unmanned aircraft operation 9 o'clock, 2 miles. Where should the remote pilot and visual observer, that is, as well, look for the traffic in reference to the small unmanned aircraft? So we described it last time in detail, but remember that when ATC calls traffic, the traffic is in relation to the nose of the manned aircraft, which was at 12 o'clock. So if there's to look, if he's heading to the west, which would be that way, and he was told to look at 9 o'clock, he'd be looking that way. For you, that means you're down here somewhere, and you should be, assuming you're not really in your drone, but you're down here operating here, you should be looking what direction to find your traffic. You should be looking that way, which is north. Oh, that wasn't the final one. Okay, one more. But anyway, pause the video, try to come up with the answer of this one as well. I'm going to move on. Okay, unmanned aircraft planning and arrival. So I'm going to do a little scenario here of what the manned aircraft pilot is doing. And that might help you to sort of orient yourself to what you'll be listening to on the radio. So for an unmanned aircraft that's planning on arriving at let's just use the example of the Griffin-Spalding County Airport, the first thing he would do, he'd tune his transceiver into the automatic weather observation station. And that is this AWOS station right here, 119.75. He'd listen because that's a recorded weather information Then using that information, he will make some decisions about the airport. I mean, if the weather's so bad that he doesn't want to land there, then he makes some decision about going somewhere else. But assuming the weather's good enough to land, he's going to find out what the wind is. For example, let's say the AWOS recording was saying the wind was 270 at 10 knots. Knowing that information, then he'll make a decision about which runway he would prefer to land on. Manned aircraft, all aircraft really, except for drones, land into the wind. Birds do as well. Land into the wind with the nose into the wind, so it makes a shorter landing distance. The preferred runway here would be runway 32 because the wind is blowing from here, 270 wind, so that'd be the closest one to going down the runway. Better yet be if the wind was blowing straight down the runway, but sometimes you don't get that choice. So he decides he's going to land on runway 32. So the aircraft's approaching the Griffin Spalding Airport. Before he gets 10 miles out, or somewhere around the 10-mile mark, he tunes into the CTAF frequency. Remember that? There was that C right there. That means CTAF. And so that's the frequency he tunes his transceiver into so that he can start listening and call the Griffin area traffic to let them know. There's no control tower here. It's Magenta Airport. There's no control tower, so he's letting people, other aircraft, manned aircraft, and UAVs for that matter, he's letting others know where he is, what his intention is. So he'll say something like, by the way, just before we go too far here, that's an F. That's a published frequency, 123.075. If there wasn't, he'd use multicom 122.9. That's the frequency. If there isn't a number published up here, we use multicom. Multicom is the frequency that for air-to-air communication. So if there's not a published frequency, or if two airplanes want to talk to each other, they both tune into 122.9 and they can talk to each other. So if the airport doesn't have a CTF frequency listed, they use 122.9. That's a FYI. There will be questions on that though. But he's got the weather. He tunes himself into the CTAF frequency. When he gets about 10 miles out, he calls to let Griffin traffic know, anybody else in the area. He'll say something like this. He'll say, Griffin traffic, Cessna 123, Foxtrot Yankee, 10 miles east of the airport, landing runway 32. Griffin traffic. So he's given anybody that's in the area that might be listening on that frequency now knows, and including you as a remote pilot, know that this guy is 10 miles east of the airport. He's intending to land on runway 32. From that information, the remote pilot now can make some decisions depending on where he is. If you are operating in the east, if you're over, over here somewhere, you know he's heading this way. So you at least be alert. You'll know to look towards the east to find him because he'll be heading over this way. He's over here somewhere, 10 miles out. Going this way towards the airport somehow, he's going to be coming towards you. Gives you a big clue about where he is. That's the whole point. That's the point the FAA is making, is you need to be able to know, be familiar enough with the pilot lingo, be familiar enough with the compass so that you can sort of determine where to be expecting this traffic. It's all a matter of situational awareness. It really is pretty basic. So he calls 10 miles out, lets everybody know this is where he is, this is who he is. He's a Cessna. He's not a 747 or an SR-71. So we know what kind of airplane to look for. Fairly small airplane, I guess. And so we know a little bit about him. So that's the perspective from the manned aircraft, right? For our part, as an unmanned aircraft pilot command, and knowing that we have to give way to this guy, to any air traffic control or any kind of air traffic, we have to give way to manned aircraft. Also, we're prohibited from interfering with any traffic pattern into or out of an airport. We know we have to stay out of his way. So this gives you a general idea of where to look for. By the way, as the manned aircraft get closer, he'll start making other calls for the other traffic, not talking to you necessarily, because he may not even know you're there. Probably it's best that he doesn't know you're there, but he'll make other calls to let other air traffic in the area know where he is. He may say something like, I'm going to overhead the airport at 2,000 feet, intending to enter a left downwind for runway 32, which would be the proper thing for him to do. And that will tell you something. What's a left pattern look like to you? Especially if he calls and says, I'm on left downwind for runway 32. Where is that? You need to know that. Upwind, crosswind, downwind, base, and final. So he would be here, going that way. If you're over here, depends on where you are. Maybe he might be a factory. You might be over the airport business park. Then you would be alert. Well, this guy's pretty close. I better get lower, perhaps. Whatever. He's at traffic pattern altitude, so he's about 800 feet above the ground. But still, this is why you need to know the airport traffic patterns, and also be listening to what he's doing to know where he's at. So you need to know what downwind leg means and where that is in relation to the runway. You need to know what runway 32, what that means, what that term means. I assume you do know all that stuff. All right. Here's a controlled airport. Obviously, Columbus, Georgia. It's in blue, so it's a controlled airport. So let's go through the scenario of this manned aircraft as he's approaching it. So from his point of view, we're going to talk about that. He's planning on arriving at this controlled airport, the specific one, Columbus. First thing he does, further out in 10 miles, he tunes into the ATIS frequency. That's this one here, ATIS. I don't know if you can see my writing very well, but ATIS, Automatic Terminal Information Service. Larger, medium-sized to larger airports will have this automated recording that does give some weather, but it also gives what runway they're using. So now he knows ahead of time, because the control tower is going to tell him what runway to land on, but now he knows beforehand and starts making plans. Okay, I'm going to have to land on a particular runway. And let's just say the Columbus ATIS says wind 090 at 15 knots, and of course, active runway 6. So now in his mind, he knows that he's going to be landing on this runway here, runway 6. So then he switches his radio to the control tower, right? He's got to talk to the control tower, and it's 121 or 120.1. And he listens for a second, make sure he doesn't block anybody else by pressing the mic button, and he calls the control tower. He says, Columbus Control Tower. He does it before he's 10 miles out. He calls the control tower and he says, Cessna 123 Foxtrot Yankee, 10 miles east of the airport, request landing. So you hear this. That's your big clue right now where he is and what he plans on doing. Now, you're outside of Columbus controlled airspace probably, but if you're east of the airport, he's a little, depending on how far out from the airport you are, at least you know where he is. So this is your big clue to try to start to guess where you might need to look in order to find this guy. But you keep listening because the control tower is going to respond to him. The control tower is going to say something like 123 Foxtrot Yankee. Take a heading of 200 degrees, report 5 miles from the airport, something like that. We don't know what he's going to say, but whatever it is, it will give you a clue about which way the guy's going to be going, whether he's going to be heading towards you or otherwise, but there'll be more instructions from the tower, so you listen to that to give you more clues about what's going to be happening. So again, that's the sequence of event from the manned aircraft perspective, and for our part, knowing that you, again, must give way and may not interfere with the traffic patterns, then you know what's happening, you're aware of what's happening, and you can remain clear. And again, and as the manned aircraft gets closer to this controlled airspace, control tower, he may make regular position reports as well. He may report turning left downwind for runway 6. Again, the remote pilot must know what a downwind leg means. What does that mean? What is that in relation to the runway? Runway 6, what's that mean? So all of those things you need to be aware of, and that's just simply what's going to be on the test. Here's the nomenclature of the traffic patterns, right? Left-hand turns are standard. So whatever the number of the runway is, you just turn this whole chart around depending on the runway. And those are the things. It's up crosswind leg, first departure, of course, right after they take off. So they're running down the runway into the wind as best they can. As they get faster and faster, they get enough lift on their wings. They start climbing up. As they get to about 400 feet above the ground, more or less, they make a left turn on crosswind. Then they climb up to traffic pattern altitude, maybe 800 feet, maybe 1,000 feet, depending on what kind of airplane, or maybe 500 feet if it's a helicopter. Then they turn a left turn on downwind leg. Then they turn another left turn on base leg, and then they start descending and into the final approach that they touch down at the beginning of the runway. So you need to be aware of these, what these names are and what they mean and how they relate to the actual runway number. So this runway number right here is probably runway number 9, but it's going to change depending on the airport. That all depends on the airport. But you got to know these numbers. You'll need to know these airport taxiway markings, and there'll be questions about this. There's mandatory instruction signs. There'll be red background with white. There's some examples here. The top one is, by the way, red background with white inscriptions is to mark an entrance to a runway, a critical area, or a prohibited area. You're not allowed to go onto a runway until you have a specific clearance to get on the runway. So this one here, that's telling you that this is runway 422, stop. Here's another one basically saying runway 4, stop, can't go there. There's an ILS critical area, stop, can't go there. Here's just a sign here that you can't, for these three, stop until you get clearance. This one here is just telling you that's the end of the taxiway. You can't go any further. Don't be a dummy. Don't go there. It's the end of the taxiway. Location signs are black with yellow inscriptions. So here's location. Here's where you are. You're on Taxiway Bravo. Or here's another sign that says this is runway 22. That's just identifies a taxiway or a runway location, or perhaps the boundary of the runway, or identify something else like hold short lines for a runway. Tells you there, you're there, and I'll cover that in a second. Then there's destination signs, which are yellow background with black inscription and arrows. Provide information such as this way to go to get somewhere. So if you want to go to the terminal, there's a yellow one here. Go that way, turn to the right. If you want to go to runway 22, this is the way to go. Go that way. If you're going to go to Taxiway Bravo, this one here is telling you that's which way to go to Bravo. You turn to the right. Sometimes they'll have left arrows, obviously, or sometimes they'll have arrows pointing straight ahead. All right? So that's just examples, obviously. Information signs will just be yellow background with black inscriptions without an arrow, perhaps, or with. Runway distance markers. This is a runway distance remaining marker, and this is saying they're labeled down the runway. So here's the runway, there's the end of the runway, here's the runway number 9, and there'll be a sign here that says 4. There's a sign here that says 2. A sign here that says 1. That's 1,000 feet remaining. 1,000 feet till the end of the runway. 4,000, I'm sorry, 4, 2,000, and 1,000 feet to go. They're telling you, you better put your brakes on because you're going to hit the end, you're going to go off the end of the runway any minute now, so start slowing down, basically. Not really that pertinent to you because you're not going to be running down the runway, most likely. But that's what that means if you're curious what that meant. You probably weren't. But anyway, there'll be questions on this. Especially this one and this one. And we're going to, like I said, cover this in a second. And maybe some of those. Here's some taxiway lines are yellow. These are all taxiways in here. Yellow markings. We have yellow dashed lines here. This is a uncontrolled ramp, so you can do whatever you want out here. You can dance, you can wash your airplane, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to have permission. But to cross these lines, either that way or that way, you have to get permission from the tower to clear to get on the taxiway. If it's a controlled airport. If it's an uncontrolled airport, you're just on an active taxiway. And if it's uncontrolled, you need to be careful because there might be other airplanes on that taxiway. But it's all up to you to make that radio call to tell other traffic what you're doing. But at a controlled airport with a tower, you get permission to get on the taxiway. Taxiways are marked by yellow solid lines, that's the center line of it, and yellow lines on the edges as well. Runways are, of course, you can't get on a runway until you have specific instruction to get on the runway. It's got a white dashed line down the middle. Here's an example of that other sign where, and I think we've talked about this fairly recently, but anyway, if you're on a taxiway, now you're on a taxiway, it's okay to be here, you've already got clearance on the taxiway, but you can't, the runway's over there. This is the runway over there. And you can't cross that line until you get specific clearance from the tower. Now, if you're on the runway, hopefully you've been cleared to land or something like that, you get off the runway, you need to get across this line over here as quick as possible so that somebody else can use that runway. You're allowed to cross that line if you're over there, but if you're over here, you can't cross the line until the tower air traffic controller gives you a specific clearance to cross the runway. So that's a hold short line. Runway hold short line. It's just like a roadway sign in a sense. This is a passing lane, right? You can go that way, but you got people over here can't go that way. I don't know if that's helpful or not. Here's a couple examples of airport signs. Oh, that's true. This is saying the same thing I just said. Runway holding position markings. You need to get across that. You can pass the dotted line, but you need to get over there. But you can't go the other way unless you get specific clearance. Here is an example of a taxiway location sign. Just tells you you're on taxiway alpha, but then the red with white background tells you that's the runway. This is a hold short spot. Mandatory instruction sign, red background, white inscription. This is a marking the entrance to a runway. You got to get clearance to get on that runway. Pretty simple. And example question, when should pilots state their position on the airport when calling the tower for takeoff? That would be when they're over here and they want to go this way and take off. They have to call the tower and tell them, I'm ready for takeoff. The answer, of course, being when departing from a runway intersection. This is an intersection between the taxiway and the runway. It's a little more nuanced than that, but for the purpose of the small UAV written exam, that's what you need to know. Obviously, any of these questions, call me up. We can discuss it more. If you're a manned aircraft pilot, this is a little more complicated than simply what the test question is, but that's one specifically meant for UAVs. No, I have a few more slides. You may not be dismissed. Because we have to discuss the SIDA, secured area. The SIDA is basically secured or security identification display area. You must wear a badge, a photo ID badge issued by the airport. They have to do a background check and a lot of other things, post 9/11 situation. But anytime you're in the secure area, the SIDA area, you must have your identification badge and you must be vetted by the airport authority. It's not what passengers can't get out there. It's not one of those. It's not the TSA. It's a separate badge that you get as an employee to operate in that area. And you can see all these taxiways, all the ramp areas where baggage handlers are and mechanics wander around, all that area. Driving your pickup truck to do some maintenance, whatever. You're as an employee, this is all the secured area. People aren't allowed to wander in there that aren't identified. If you see somebody that doesn't have a badge, then you call the police. They come and haul them away because it's a security breach, right? So we have public areas. It's divided between the public area and the SIDA. Is also the passenger boarding gates, which is what's called a sterile area. They are not allowed to go into the SIDA. But people that are approved to go in the SIDA can go into the sterile area back and forth, but you can't, got to be identified. There's also what's called, you don't really need to know, but I'm going to tell you anyway, AOA is the aircraft operating area. People with the SIDA badge are not allowed to be out there because that's where the airplanes are. That's where they're moving around, and they're actually clearance. You have to be at a clearance from the tower as an aircraft. Well, no, actually, that's wrong. There certain vehicles are authorized to operate in the AOA or the airport operation area. However, they need a radio clearance as well, or clearance from the tower as well, to operate from the ground control or tower to operate in that area. But anyway, that's more than you wanted to know about that. Sources of information about airports. Where is the most extensive information found? It's in the Chart Supplement US. All of the airports in the country are listed here. A bunch of information. Of course, the airport identifier, the name of the airport, where they Nebraska, right? Latitude and longitude information. Okay, airport runways specifically, and information about those runways. Like, for example, if it's left-hand pattern, if it's non-standard patterns, if it's left-hand patterns, they don't put anything down because it's normal. But if it's right-hand pattern, especially if it's uncontrolled airport, they'll list that so that you know it's non-standard ahead of time. They'll tell you about the lighting systems on these runways as well. This is declared distance. You don't need that. Airport remarks. There you can find some information, interesting information there. There are some questions that ask you about specific things that are there. This says birds in the vicinity of airports. Well, there's a specific question asking that. What do you need to be concerned about at Lincoln Airport in Nebraska? So what are they talking about? Well, one of the answers will be birds are in the vicinity of the airport. That's the answer. Gives you weather sources. You can make the phone calls or the radio frequencies for getting weather, communication information, CTAF, tower frequencies, airspace class. That's interesting. Tells you it's Class C, this particular airport. Gives you, I don't see it right here. Usually the manager of the airport, you can call him up in the middle of the night and complain about something and get on his naughty list if that's what you want to do, right? So there's different airports listed. There's another airport. Now, this information is published occasionally. There's a schedule, but don't worry about it. But what happens if something changes? The radio frequency can change. There's nothing says it can't change, or even the airspace. How do you find the information from one time to the next? NOTAM, notices to airmen. That's, again, why you would want to, if you're going to operate near this airport, you would want to call your flight service station or did some research online. You can find this in other information places, but that's the easiest way to get it. And ask them if there's any NOTAMs for this airport. There may be a frequency change, there may be something. As you're talking to somebody about the NOTAMs, he'll also tell you if there are any TFRs involved in this airspace. Temporary flight restriction, remember that's prohibited. Nobody gets permission to fly in there. So this is very extensive, but it doesn't give any updates because it's published. It's published often, but it still gets published, and there means there'll be a period of time where there isn't anything revised because they don't revise it every day. Obviously not. So that's the main source of information. There is a lot of information on the chart, though, on the sectional chart. And we've seen that before. We've talked about that before. There's a lot of information about that. Even the non-standard traffic patterns can be listed on the chart as well. Frequencies are there. Airport elevations there. A lot of the information that you find in the chart supplement. Chart supplement just gives a lot more because you just can't fit all that printed ink onto a chart. Charts have the same problem, though. Things change in between times, publishing times, so you do need to check the NOTAMs. It specifically ask for if there are any TFRs involving the area of your operation. It's one of the things you tell them when you call them up, is where you're going to operate and what kind of airplane you're operating. Okay, we need to know about the airport lights. At nearly all airports, there's some kind of a beacon because they're hard to find in the dark for a manned aircraft. So you see a white and a green and a white and a green and a white and a green flashing light. It's lighted land airport. If it's white and yellow, it's a lighted water airport. I know there's not a lot of those around here. You got to go to Florida, or you got to go somewhere where there's a lot of lakes, Minnesota, Canada, right? White and yellow. These are international, by the way. Heliports, like the hospital over here, green, yellow, white, green, yellow, white, green, yellow, white. That's a heliport. 2 quick white flashes and a long green flash. That's a military airport. Robins Air Force Base. Not that you'll be flying the drone too close to them, but that's true. Now, usually rotating beacons or airport beacons, they turn them on at dark to enhance the ability for manned aircraft to find the airport. And when the sun comes up in the morning, they turn them off. But also, many airports will turn them on in the day if the visibility becomes less than 3 miles. So if the weather starts deteriorating and the visibility goes down below 3 miles, how many miles do we need to operate our UAV? Well, if you happen to be operating near an airport and the rotating beacon on, you might want to check to see what the visibility is. But they'll also sometimes do it if the ceiling gets less than 1,000 feet also. So they're just telling manned aircraft, hey, you know, the weather's not too good here. You can't depend on that, though, because sometimes, like at Griffin, the airport manager is out doing something, and so he may not turn the light on if the weather gets. So you can't depend on that. You do need to check the weather from other sources, but that's just as FYI, little information about it. Additional lights at airports are taxiway edge lights are in blue, taxiway center line lights are in green lights, and flashing yellow lights are runway guard lights. So when you come up to at night, when you come up to the edge of you're cleared for taxi, and you get to the edge of the runway, there'll be some red, yellow flashing lights. That's an indication if it's a controlled airport that you need to call a tower. If it's an uncontrolled airport, just warning you that you're about to enter a runway and there could be somebody flying down out of the sky, landing on that runway. You might want to check the radio frequency to make sure you're the only one out there. Almost finished. This is the last slide. Yep, it is. The bird or other wildlife strike report. There's questions on this. This is what it looks like. But really, the only question involves the choice between filling out the form, which this is, or calling air traffic controllers and letting them know you just hit a bird or something like that. The answer is basically don't report, you fill out the report. However, in real life, if you're flying along, if you're a drone, you definitely don't want to call ATC and tell them that. They don't care about you. But if you're in a manned aircraft and you hit a bird, it's helpful to let people know that there are birds out here and that they're not very bright birds. They'll fly into you, and that's, if you're a manned pilot, you try to avoid that because that's not good. But that is it for this module. We'll carry on and keep reviewing. Remember, call, text, email, questions, any issues that you might have, because that's what I'm here for, here to help if I can. We do want you to pass the knowledge exam with the highest score possible. All right. Use the FAA study guide. Good night.